Hello, I'm Dr. Rosalind Watts. I'm a clinical psychologist and a psychedelic researcher. I worked as a clinical psychologist for many years in the NHS, providing talking therapy for people with depression and other difficulties. And then I joined the Imperial Centre for Psychedelic Research in the Psilocybin for depression, the first study, which was in 2015, and then the second study, which we've just completed now. So in my work in this study, I led the therapy team, providing these psilocybin treatment sessions for people with depression. So our team sat through many sessions with people who'd been suffering for a really long time, and people who had never found anything that had been helpful for them. Because for people to come and do a psilocybin study, considering the amount of stigma and misunderstanding around psilocybin, meant for many of them that they had really got to a very desperate place where they didn't feel they had any options left at all. So most of them were very frightened about the idea of taking psilocybin. They'd seen the kind of main media narrative that we still have, the kind of legacy of psychedelic drugs being frying your brain and being very dangerous and sending you crazy. So they were very cautious and tentative, but they really didn't have any other options, and many of them were feeling like life didn't hold any meaning for them anymore. So they very bravely took part in our study, and they had 2 psilocybin sessions with therapists sitting there with them. And of course, we do very careful screening to make sure that people are fully safe to take psilocybin. And we have quite a clear idea now of the contraindications and who it's safe for. And after that screening process, they would be supported by psychologists, psychiatrists, our whole team, through this process of really psilocybin assisted therapy. So it's talking therapy that is boosted by these psilocybin experiences, where somebody sits in a room with a playlist, music, particularly selected music playlist, and psilocybin capsules, and they lie on the hospital bed in a room that's nicely decorated and softly lit. And with the presence of the therapist, the psilocybin allows them to go into the very deepest parts of themselves and to meet the demons that might be lurking there, or just the things that they need to focus on, the things that are standing in the way of them living a full life. And it kind of makes me laugh when people not really laughing, it's really not funny, but it's surprising to me and always amazes me really that people see psilocybin as a potentially threatening, as a kind of recreational drug, that, we need to be very restrictive of it, because if it got on the wrong hands, people would want to take this as a party drug and it would, overrun the country and everybody wants to be taking psilocybin. It amazes me because in actual fact, psilocybin experience for people, in all of my experience of the 6 years I've been doing this now, the experience of people when they are having a psilocybin experience it's often completely harrowing. It's really painful. It's not a pleasant experience for most people. It requires so much courage going down into those depths. And it's like a very deep turbocharged experience of confronting the parts of yourself that you don't normally want to look at. So I see it as something with huge potential, but something that is still so misunderstood in many ways, and also very scarcely researched. So people have been using psilocybin, magic mushrooms, for thousands of years. It's one of the kind of healing modalities from indigenous communities that has stood the test of time. In Mexico, Mazatec healers were using mushrooms as part of their healing community work. And even after the Spanish Inquisition tried to kind of stop those practices, they survived because they were useful, they were beneficial, they were valued by the community. So those communities still use them now. They've really stood the test of time. Yet, despite this very long history of these tools as healing tools that can really support people to discover more about themselves, the research that we have on them in the West is very small because of restrictions that came in when psilocybin was made illegal, based, I would say, on misunderstandings and actually flawed evidence. If you look back at the research on psilocybin that kind of led to it being considered dangerous, there are many issues with that research. And in all of my experience, this is, well, I think in the drug surveys, psilocybin comes out as the least harmful, much, much lower than alcohol and tobacco, with a very, very minimal potential for kind of misuse and addiction. It's not really addictive. It's actually anti-addictive, because if you keep taking it, it actually stops working. So it's anti-addictive. And in fact, the small amount of studies we do have looking at it in clinical populations, some of that research is looking at people with addiction, and actually psilocybin seems to be a really effective treatment against addiction, to help people stop addiction, because it helps you see those parts of yourself that have been hidden away. And often addiction is about a kind of a way of trying to manage those hidden aspects of self. So I think that it's kind of very clear to me now, after this work that I've been doing, that we really need to know much, much more about psilocybin. We need to do so many more studies. We need to understand how it's working, who it works best for. We need to develop different kind of therapeutic modalities and compare them. The results from the 2 studies we did at Imperial were so promising and incredible, really. We found in the most recent study that it was at least as good as the current gold standard treatment for depression and SSRI medication. But in actual fact, with working with the participants in the study, we compared a group of people taking psilocybin, having psilocybin experiences, to people having SSRI antidepressant medication daily. And although both were effective, those that were in the SSRI condition, when we spoke to them about how they were feeling, they said, yeah, I feel a bit better, nothing major changed. Often they described feeling a bit numb, that the real pain and anguish and desolation was helped. They didn't feel the lows, but they also didn't feel the highs. They were in a bit of a kind of numbed place, which some of them found difficult, and it meant that they actually wanted to go off the antidepressant medication, because they felt a bit, sometimes they said a bit like a zombie, they felt a bit blunted. Whereas the people in the psilocybin condition described feeling this sense of connection to themselves, other people, and the natural world. We see over and over and over again that psilocybin therapy seems to lead people to connect to nature in a way that is really fascinating to me. And that connection to nature then can go on to become a source of ongoing recovery and healing, because then people can spend time in nature and get so many of the benefits that we know from research comes from that kind of nature contact. And also a wish to protect nature, which is another thing for us to be focusing on at this moment in history. So yeah, I mean, there's so much potential. But the other thing that I see over and over and over again is that this psilocybin it's not like other drugs, and it's something where I think we really need to educate the public, and we really need to educate the health service and politicians and ourselves and each other around how psilocybin is working, because it isn't like a drug like other drugs, in the sense that it's something that needs to be given in a therapeutic relationship, in a therapeutic setting. That's part of it. The 2 of them work together, but also it doesn't just cure depression. One kind of session of this drug and the depression is cured. It actually the depression will come back after a while. So I think in order to really think about how psilocybin can fit into our society, it's going to require very much we're going to need a kind of new structures in order to understand how to fit it in. It won't fit into the existing structures that we have. And I think that's one of the holdups right now, is that it's very difficult for people that are used to regulating drugs and understanding drugs to understand psilocybin. And so, we need education, and we need research. So one of the things that was most really amazing about working in both of the studies is that over and over again, we would see people who had been incredibly crippled by long-going chronic depression prior to coming in, having this glimpse, this moment of things opening up, and after the psilocybin treatment session, in a way that they were amazed at themselves, that they didn't think anything was going to work in that kind of way ever for them. And many of them had been wanting to end their lives for a long period of time because life had felt unlivable, too painful for just so long. And one of the participants in the first study described how the psilocybin experience was like turning on the lights in a dark house. He described how he'd just been in the darkness for so long, and then there was just this hope, and he could see his life, he could see everything around him and appreciate it. But of course, the effect it's not a miracle cure. It's a process, it's a therapeutic process. And we would think that somebody with depression would probably need to be involved in some kind of therapeutic process with repeated experiences. So not just one-off psilocybin experience, but maybe one every couple of years or something like that, maybe even once a year for a few years. And with this particular man, he felt after the lights turning on in the dark house that the light started to dim again after about 6 months, which is what we tend to see. And at that point, he campaigned for psilocybin to be rescheduled, because he could see that for him to be able to access this treatment, the only treatment that had ever helped him, there was going to need to be changes in the law to enable more research, to enable the treatments to come through, to enable him and others like him to benefit. So after his campaigning, he lost hope because he felt like nothing was changing. He was knocking on doors that weren't opening. His depression got worse and worse. And then about 3 years after his participation in the study, I got that phone call that we in our team were always dreading, from a family member of his, saying that he had nearly died, that he'd tried to take his life and that he'd very nearly succeeded, and that he didn't, but that he nearly had, and that's how bad the depression had got. And so I asked him if I could share his story, because he cares so much about this, and he said that was important to share. And I think so really it's for him and all the other people like him who are living in that dark house and just have a right to access a treatment like this, especially those who have already experienced it. They have a right to further access. And the other thing that concerns me is that for him and many others, if they have experienced something like this, it's the only thing that's ever worked for them, then if they do not have access, then there's a risk that people will do it themselves. Mushrooms grow everywhere in the UK, that people will take their treatment into their own hands through desperation, and that they will have sessions on their own. And considering the nature of the sessions that the things that we see, that we saw in the study, people with a lot of trauma, most people with depression are carrying a lot of trauma. When that comes out, it can be incredibly powerful and painful and really require a lot of support and follow-up and aftercare. So it really concerns me that people will try and do this, self-medicate. And I think there's been a lot in the media recently about psilocybin and the potential it offers as a treatment for depression. And so some of the community work I've been doing with, we call it integration groups, where people that are doing this kind of work can come and explore the therapeutic integration of this work into their lives. In the community integration groups that are there, we see increasing numbers of people who are inspired by the headlines about psilocybin. They can see the results of these studies and they're taking psychedelics themselves. It's very easy to access psychedelics illegally, so it would seem. So, or maybe just to pick them from the ground. So we do see a lot of people using them illegally, and I think that's a real threat. So I would really love to see psilocybin rescheduled, much more research happening, and compassionate access schemes to enable people that really need it and have proven that they can take it safely with support to be able to access psilocybin treatment in an ongoing way.